I'm posting this here because I don't really know where else it belongs. Confessions feels dramatic, but life stories feels dishonest. This sits somewhere in between. My name's William, and for a long stretch of my life I made money by moving numbers around on a screen, numbers that decided whether someone paid off a mortgage, delayed retirement, or lost everything. This is the story of one of the times I crossed the line from playing the game to rigging it. The backstory isn't glamorous. I wasn't some mastermind in a penthouse. I was a mid-level guy with a decent resume, a caffeine problem, and a constant sense that I was one bad quarter away from being irrelevant. I'd grown up watching my parents panic over bills, and somewhere along the way I internalized this idea that security only existed if you could outsmart the system before it outsmarted you. When I finally landed in the financial world, it felt like I'd been handed the control panel to reality itself. The motive was equal parts fear and ego. Fear of sliding backward, ego from realizing how much power was baked into just data. I told myself I wasn't hurting real people, just adjusting probabilities. Lines went up, lines went down. It all felt abstract, until it didn't. At the time, though, I was convinced I was smarter than the chaos, that I could bend outcomes without anyone noticing. I wasn't desperate in the cinematic sense. I was comfortable enough to be dangerous. The circumstances lined up quietly. No dramatic countdowns, no whispered threats. Just long nights, glowing monitors, and the slow realization that if I nudged things the right way, the market would listen. Or at least, that's what I believed then. This post isn't about bragging. It's about finally admitting that the moment I decided numbers mattered more than people, I stopped being the person I thought I was. That's the setup. The rest of this story is how I prepared, what I did, and how those neat little digits followed me long after the screens went dark. Before I ever thought of myself as a criminal, I thought of myself as observant. That's how it starts, I think. You notice patterns. You notice loopholes. You notice how often people assume systems are airtight just because they're complicated. My job involved monitoring price movements for a basket of small-cap stocks tied to a derivative product most retail investors didn't really understand. Even a lot of professionals treated it like background noise. What I noticed was lag. Not the kind you see on a bad internet connection, but institutional lag. Data from certain exchanges updated milliseconds later than others. In human terms, that's nothing. In algorithmic trading terms, it's a small eternity. At first, it was just curiosity. I'd watch how prices updated across platforms. I'd compare timestamps. I'd run little simulations at home, telling myself it was educational. I wasn't planning anything yet. I was mapping terrain. Then I noticed something else. Internal controls were siloed. The team that validated trades wasn't the same team that monitored market anomalies. The people who built the models didn't sit near the people who reviewed compliance reports. Everyone assumed someone else was watching the big picture. That's when the door appeared. Not wide open. Not glowing. Just cracked enough that if you pushed carefully, it wouldn't creak. I told myself I was stress testing the system. That I was doing the company a favor by seeing how robust it really was. I ran hypothetical scenarios where small price movements, multiplied by volume and timed correctly, could generate massive profit without tripping alerts. The numbers said it was possible. That realization didn't come with fireworks. It came with a quiet, sinking feeling in my stomach. Because once you know something like that, you don't unknow it. I started thinking about money in a new way. Not as something you earn, but something you redirect. Like water in a canal. You don't create it. You just decide where it flows. I still hadn't crossed the line. But I was standing right on top of it, toes hanging over, telling myself I was just looking down. There's a specific moment when a bad idea stops being theoretical and starts becoming a plan. For me, it was the night I built a sandbox version of the trade flow on my personal laptop. I exported anonymized data from work, which was already a line I pretended not to see, and recreated the environment as closely as I could. Same timing gaps. Same order routing logic. Same volume thresholds. I told myself it was for skill development. That phrase did a lot of heavy lifting back then. I started running mock trades. Tiny ones at first. Fractions of what I'd need for real profit. I'd simulate placing orders milliseconds ahead of expected price shifts, then closing positions almost immediately. Over and over. I tracked how long it took for internal monitoring tools to flag anything. Nothing happened. No alerts. No emails. No knock on the door. That should have scared me. Instead, it excited me. I began treating it like a video game. Optimizing routes. Shaving off microseconds. Writing scripts that automated decision-making based on specific market conditions. I wasn't just seeing the door anymore. I was measuring its hinges. What made it easier was how boring it all looked from the outside. No hacking montages. No green text raining down a screen. Just spreadsheets, logs, and lines of code that would put most people to sleep. If someone glanced over my shoulder, it looked like normal quant busywork. I also started planning in a more human way. I noted which coworkers left early, who skipped logging minor adjustments, which managers rubber-stamped reports as long as nothing spiked above a certain threshold. I learned who liked being flattered, who hated confrontation, who never asked follow-up questions. None of them felt like targets at the time. They were just environmental variables. That's another lie you tell yourself, that you're not betraying people, just navigating systems. By the end of that month, I wasn't asking if anymore. I was asking, how much? And that question felt both terrifying and intoxicating. Because once you start measuring a crime in dollar amounts, you've already accepted that you're going to commit it. Once I accepted I was going to do it, the fear changed shape. It wasn't, I might ruin my life, fear anymore. It became, I need to do this clean, fear. I didn't want a big score. Big scores attract gravity. I wanted steady, boring, deniable profit. The kind that looks like competence, not luck. So I built layers. First layer, multiple internal accounts tied to different desks, all justified by overlapping projects. Nothing unusual on its own. Just messy enough to look organic. Second layer, time dispersion. Instead of one large manipulation, I planned dozens of tiny ones across different windows. No single moment would look suspicious. Third layer, narrative. I started subtly talking about a new strategy I'd been experimenting with. Nothing specific. Just enough breadcrumbs that, if numbers improved, people could mentally attach a story to it. Humans love explanations. I also adjusted my lifestyle. No sudden purchases. No flashy upgrades. I kept my apartment. Kept my car. Let the money accumulate quietly. The hardest part was patience. Every instinct wanted to test it immediately. But I forced myself to wait. Because the difference between a mistake and a crime is preparation. And I was done pretending this was still an experiment. The first real step was small. So small I could have told myself it was a mistake. I chose a stock with low volume and almost no analyst coverage. Nothing trendy. Nothing people talked about online. Just a quiet ticker that blended into the noise. I launched the script 10 minutes before market open. It placed a sequence of micro buys. Small enough not to spike the price. Frequent enough to suggest interest. Then I routed several larger orders through a different internal channel. The price twitched. Not a jump. Not a surge. A nudge. My hands started sweating immediately. I stared at the chart like it might stare back. 30 seconds later I sold. The profit was under $2,000. Laughable. But the number didn't matter. What mattered was the silence. No alert. No email. No manager appearing behind me. The market opened. People around me talked about weekend plans. Keyboards clacked. The world stayed normal. I sat there, hard hammering, realizing something heavy and irreversible. It worked. Not in theory. Not in simulation. In reality. And once you know you can bend something without consequences, you stop seeing it as solid. You start seeing it as clay. After the first time, I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. I didn't even move. I just sat there, letting my heartbeat slow down. The danger wasn't getting caught. The danger was getting comfortable. I waited 3 days before doing it again. Different stock. Different time window. Same pattern. Another quiet profit. Still no reaction. That's when I started scaling. Not in size. In frequency. 1 manipulation became 3 a week. 3 became 1 a day. Always small. Always boring. I adjusted my scripts to randomize timing and order sizes. I introduced intentional, losing, trades so my performance graph looked human. I built failure into the system. Which felt insane. But believable. At work, my numbers started improving. Not dramatically. Just enough for people to nod. William's been sharp lately. Whatever he's doing, it's working. Those comments felt better than the money. They felt like permission. At night, I told myself I wasn't stealing. I was exploiting inefficiencies. Big institutions did worse things every day. I was just playing their game better. That lie became my pillow. I slept on it every night. And slowly, I stopped dreaming about anything else. Around the 3rd month, I stopped checking balances. Not because I didn't care. Because the numbers stopped meaning anything. 5,000. 10,000. 50. They all felt the same. What mattered was execution. Precision. Control. Every morning became a ritual. Coffee. Terminal. Quiet scan of which stocks were thin enough to bend. I'd run my scripts, watch the micro movements, close positions, log out. It took less than 15 minutes most days. The rest of the day I played the role. Meetings. Emails. Nods. Small talk. Nobody suspected the guy who volunteered to review models. Nobody suspects boring. The first time I used some of the money, I felt nothing. Paid off a credit card. No rush. No guilt. Just a checkbox. That scared me more than panic ever could. I expected greed. What I got was numbness. People around me still talked about the market, like it was weather. Unpredictable. Uncontrollable. I knew better. I knew some of it moved because I told it to. That knowledge settled into me quietly. Like a parasite that doesn't hurt. At first. The first problem didn't come from compliance. It came from a human. A junior analyst named Mark started asking questions. Not accusatory ones. Curious ones. He noticed correlations between tiny volume spikes and short-lived price bumps. He framed it as a puzzle. Probably noise, he said. I agreed. Too quickly. After that, I became aware of every footstep behind me. Every pause in conversation. Every glance at my screen. Nothing had changed. But everything felt louder. I modified my scripts again. More randomness. Longer gaps between actions. Smaller position sizes. My profits dipped. Which made me anxious. Which made me angry at myself for caring. I watched Mark from a distance. He wasn't digging. He wasn't escalating. He was just thinking. That scared me more than an investigation. Because systems follow rules. People follow instincts. I considered stopping. Not forever. Just taking a break. Letting the trail cool. But the idea of giving it up felt like losing a limb. I told myself I'd already gone too far. That stopping wouldn't erase anything. So I kept going. More carefully. More quietly. With a new weight sitting in my chest. The kind that doesn't go away. Mark didn't confront me. That would have been easier. He just kept orbiting closer. Asking what models I liked. What data sources I trusted. How I handled slippage. Normal questions. Except I knew why he was asking. I started answering with half-truths. Enough detail to sound helpful. Enough vagueness to stay useless. Lying became a daily skill. Not dramatic lies. Casual ones. The kind that slide into conversation unnoticed. I also made a decision. A bad one. I increased size. Not huge. Just enough to offset my reduced frequency. If I was taking more risk, I wanted more reward. That's the sentence every criminal eventually says. The trade still worked. The silence remained. But my nerves were shot. Every successful manipulation felt less like victory and more like borrowed time. I stopped enjoying weekends. I checked my phone constantly. I dreamed about graphs. Straight lines. Sudden drops. Email subject lines I never actually received. Sometimes I'd catch myself rehearsing explanations. Hypothetical conversations with managers. With investigators. With lawyers. That was new. Before I told myself I was invisible. Now I knew I was just unobserved. There's a difference. And it's terrifying. The near disaster came on a Tuesday. Nothing special about it. No big economic news. No volatility spike. Just another day I expected to control. I targeted a thin biotech stock. Low liquidity. Perfect candidate. The script fired. Micro buys went through. Price started creeping up. I routed the larger orders. Then something I hadn't predicted happened. Another large player entered. Not reacting to me. Just operating independently. Their volume stacked on top of mine. The price jumped harder than planned. Too fast. Too visible. My stomach dropped. This was exactly what I tried to avoid. I aborted the exit. Waited. The stock kept climbing. Now I was trapped inside my own manipulation. If I sold, the drop would be obvious. If I held, exposure increased every second. I watched the chart like it was a bomb timer. Then the other buyer suddenly pulled back. Price wobbled. I dumped everything in a staggered burst. The chart spiked and crashed within 90 seconds. Ugly. Very ugly. My profit was large. Larger than anything before. But I didn't feel rich. I felt sick. I spent the rest of the day expecting someone to tap my shoulder. No one did. That was worse. Because I knew how close I'd come. And I knew I'd still do it again. After that day I stopped pretending this was temporary. I wasn't testing systems anymore. I wasn't dabbling. This was my real job. Everything else was theater. I woke up already thinking about order flow. I fell asleep replaying charts in my head. I started measuring time in market windows instead of hours. The version of me that existed before this began felt distant, like a childhood memory that doesn't quite belong to you anymore. I noticed how easily I could switch personalities. At work I was calm, helpful, slightly self-deprecating. Inside I was constantly calculating. Risk versus reward. Visibility versus profit. I began keeping a private ledger, encrypted, hidden, obsessive. Not just numbers. Notes. Patterns. Mistakes. Adjustments. It felt responsible. Professional. I also started isolating myself. Fewer drinks after work. Fewer conversations that weren't necessary. People create unpredictability. Unpredictability creates risk. Sometimes I'd look at coworkers laughing and feel like I was watching a different species. They thought the system was real. I knew it was soft. And knowing that made me feel powerful in a way that also made me feel completely alone. The email went out company-wide. Subject line about routine market behavior review. Those 4 words nearly stopped my heart. I read the message 5 times. General audit. External consultants. Cooperation appreciated. No names. No accusations. But I felt targeted anyway. For the first time, I seriously considered deleting everything. Wiping scripts. Wiping logs. Walking away. But sudden cleanliness looks suspicious. People who panic leave fingerprints. So I did nothing. Which was its own kind of torture. Meetings started appearing on calendars. People whispered in hallways. Compliance walked the floor more than usual. I answered every question with boring enthusiasm. Yes, here's my methodology. Yes, here's my documentation. Yes, happy to help. All true. None relevant. Because the real machinery didn't live on company servers. It lived in my head and on a laptop at home. The consultants focused on a different desk. A different product. Someone else's sloppy overleveraged strategy. They found issues. They made recommendations. They moved on. Relief didn't feel like relief. It felt like confirmation. Confirmation that the system wasn't designed to catch someone careful. It was designed to catch someone loud. And I wasn't loud. Which meant I was free. Which also meant I was choosing to stay. Getting away with it didn't feel like winning. It felt like something heavy had been welded to my spine. Every successful manipulation stacked on top of the last one, not as money, but as mass. I carried all of them with me. I started noticing small changes in myself. I flinched when someone said my name unexpectedly. I memorized exit routes in buildings. I avoided eye contact with security guards I'd spoken to 100 times before. None of this was logical. Nobody was chasing me. But my body didn't care about logic. It acted like I was constantly mid-escape. I also stopped thinking about the future. Not in a hopeful way. Not in a planning way. The future became a fog I didn't want to look into because I couldn't imagine it without this secret inside it. Promotion sounded meaningless. Long-term relationships felt impossible. How do you build a life on top of a foundation you know is rotten? Sometimes I'd open my private ledger and scroll through past entries, not to admire the profits, but to remind myself how deep I was. It wasn't motivation. It was proof of captivity. I wasn't doing this because I wanted more. I was doing it because I no longer knew how to be the person who didn't. I can't tell you exactly when people disappeared from the equation. It wasn't a single switch. It was erosion. At first I imagined vague investors. Then I stopped imagining anyone at all. Trades became shapes. Candles. Liquidity pools. When a stock dipped because of me, I didn't picture someone on the other side losing. I pictured a successful execution. That's the most dangerous part. Not cruelty. Abstraction. One night I accidentally saw a forum post from a guy talking about how a sudden dip wiped out his savings. He named the ticker. One I recognized. One I had touched before. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. I waited for guilt. It came, but it was thin. Distant. Like sympathy for a character in a movie. That realization scared me more than any investigation ever could. Because it meant I was changing in ways I couldn't easily reverse. I wasn't just doing bad things. I was becoming someone who processed bad things efficiently. Quietly. Without ceremony. Without the emotional friction that normally stops people. I had optimized myself for harm. And optimization, once it works, is hard to turn off. I never got arrested. I never got exposed. I stopped on my own, slowly, without a dramatic turning point. I dialed down frequency. Then size. Then eventually I just didn't run the scripts anymore. The money is still there. I haven't touched most of it. Not out of virtue. Out of discomfort. It feels radioactive. Like spending it would make everything more real. I don't think I'm a monster. I also don't think I'm a good person. I'm someone who learned how easy it is to cross a line when the line is abstract and the rewards are immediate. If you're reading this and you work in any system that moves money, data, or people around, understand this: integrity doesn't collapse in one moment. It erodes. You don't wake up evil. You wake up curious. Then comfortable. then justified. If you ever notice yourself explaining your behavior more than usual, that's the warning light. Listen to it. Walk away early. It's much easier to step back when you're standing near the edge than when you're already in freefall. I tell these stories not to feel forgiven. I don't expect that. I tell them because silence is another form of lying. And I'm tired of lying.